Ghosts of Hollow Ridge. Hollow Ridge had always been a quiet town, tucked away in the misty hills where the forest seemed to watch you from the shadows. The roads twisted like veins, leading to homes once filled with life and laughter. But now, those homes stood empty, silent monuments to the strange terror that drove every soul away. It started slowly, with whispers. People spoke of odd noises in the night, soft scratching at windows, distant cries that could never be traced. At first, it was brushed off as wildlife, or the wind playing tricks on weary minds. But soon, those whispers grew into something far darker. The McPherson family was the first to leave. Mrs. McPherson had woken one night to find her bedroom bathed in a sickly green light with the silhouette of a man standing in the corner. His eyes, hollow and black, stared at her. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. When the figure finally faded into the night, she was paralyzed with fear, her body ice cold as if death itself had brushed against her. Then came the strange markings. Homes began to bear cryptic symbols scrawled in ash across doors and windows. No one knew their origin, but those marks never washed away. They seemed burned into the very essence of the wood and stone. As more families fled, others reported seeing figures in the woods. Dark shapes watching from between the trees, always too far to recognize but too close to ignore. Mr. Jansen, the town's baker, swore on his life that he saw the ghostly form of his late wife standing at the edge of the forest, her eyes weeping blood as she beckoned him closer. He left Hollow Ridge the next day, his bakery abandoned. For a while, Hollow Ridge tried to carry on. Those who stayed were stubborn and unwilling to leave their homes despite the growing fear. But the haunting didn't care about their resolve. The sounds inside the houses became worse. Doors would slam shut of their own accord. Heavy footsteps would echo in empty hallways at night. In some homes, children whispered about seeing strangers in their rooms. People who vanished when the lights flicked on. But it wasn't until the Anderson family that the town truly understood the horror it faced. They had been the last to remain in their neighborhood, clinging to the hope that the hauntings were merely tricks of the mind. One fateful evening, their daughter Lily went missing. The town searched the woods, the streets, the riverbanks, but she was nowhere to be found. It was as if she had evaporated into the air. That same night, the Andersons heard her voice. It started as a soft, pleading whisper, calling to them from the attic. "Mommy, Daddy, help me." They rushed upstairs, desperate, but when they reached the attic, there was nothing but cold air and dust. The voice grew louder, more frantic. "Help me! It's dark! So dark!" Desperation turned to dread. They searched every corner of the house, every crack in the walls, but Lily was gone. Yet, the voice never left. For days, they could hear her crying, sobbing, begging for help. But as the nights dragged on, the cries turned cruel. They became something monstrous. Lily's voice twisted into something hollow, filled with malice. "You left me here," it hissed. "Now I'll never leave." The Andersons fled in the dead of night, their faces as pale as the ghosts that haunted their town. One by one, the remaining families packed what little they could carry and left Hollow Ridge behind, the once vibrant town now a hollow shell. The houses, no longer homes, stood like tombstones, each one harboring its own unspeakable horrors. Windows gaped like eyes, watching, waiting for anyone foolish enough to return. No one does, of course. Not anymore. But sometimes, travelers passing through the hills at night claim they hear something on the wind. A soft voice, like a child calling for help. Others swear they've seen lights flickering in the old homes, faint but persistent, as if someone or something still roams the abandoned streets of Hollow Ridge. And those who linger too long often speak of the feeling that something unseen is watching, lurking just out of sight. Something waiting for the town to welcome new residents. Because the ghosts of Hollow Ridge are patient, and they will not rest until their town is full once more. The fear of the cursed, the town of Hollow Ridge. In the quiet, isolated hills where the trees grew dense and dark, there lay a forgotten town. Hollow Ridge. For years it stood untouched by outsiders, hidden beneath a veil of fog so thick it seemed to swallow sound and sight. The only whisper of its existence came through rumors, dark tales of a cursed town, of shadows that moved on their own, and a sickness that clung to the land like death itself. The town's curse was said to have started decades ago, after a tragic event no one could quite remember. All that was certain was that the people of Hollow Ridge had turned in on themselves. The air was thick with paranoia, and something unseen stalked its streets. For years, no one entered Hollow Ridge. Those few brave souls who did never returned, their fates a mystery. Some say the town itself devoured them. Others whispered that they had been claimed by the curse. It was in this atmosphere of dread that Rachel, a young journalist with a love for mysteries, found herself driving towards Hollow Ridge. She had read the stories, seen the photos of the eerie, abandoned town. The rational part of her knew the curse was a myth, an old legend to scare away trespassers, but curiosity gnawed at her. She had to know what really lay within the heart of Hollow Ridge. As Rachel approached, the fog thickened unnaturally, reducing visibility to mere feet. The forest pressed in from either side, branches twisting in the mist like skeletal hands reaching for her car. A heavy dread settled over her, making her chest tight. But she pushed on. The first sign of the town was a decrepit wooden sign swaying in the breeze. "Welcome to Hollow Ridge." Its letters were faded, barely legible, as though time had tried to erase them. Rachel felt a shiver run down her spine. She was here. The town itself was eerily quiet, save for the soft rustling of wind through broken windows. The houses, once quaint and charming, stood abandoned, their paint peeling and roofs sagging as though weighed down by some invisible force. She parked her car and stepped out, her boots crunching on the cracked pavement. "Just an old town," Rachel whispered to herself, her voice sounding too loud in the silence. She started down the main road, her eyes flicking to every shadow, every corner. Something felt wrong. The air was thick, oppressive, as though the town was alive and watching her. Her breath quickened and her steps grew faster. There was no sound of life, no birds, no insects, just the eerie, unnatural quiet. She passed a row of crumbling storefronts, their windows dark and empty. A tattered old flyer flapped in the breeze, advertising a town festival from years ago. Rachel reached out to touch it, and her fingers recoiled at the icy cold that radiated from the paper. Her footsteps echoed through the empty streets as she made her way to the heart of Hollow Ridge, the town square. A massive, twisted oak tree stood in the center, its gnarled branches reaching up to the sky like claws. Beneath it, the ground seemed scorched, blackened, as if something terrible had taken root there. As Rachel approached the tree, she felt the air grow colder, and a sudden wave of nausea washed over her. The hairs on her arms stood on end, and her instincts screamed for her to leave. But something pulled her closer. Carved into the tree's trunk was a name, barely visible beneath the layers of bark. She leaned in, squinting to make it out. Annabelle Reed. The name sounded familiar, a whisper from the stories she'd read about Hollow Ridge. Annabelle Reed had been one of the first to go missing when the curse had begun. Suddenly, a low hum filled the air. Rachel froze, her heart pounding in her chest. It was coming from the tree, the deep, resonant sound of something. Alive. She took a step back, and that's when she heard it. Footsteps behind her. Whirling around, she saw nothing but empty street. Yet the sound persisted, growing closer and closer, until it was right behind her. Cold breath brushed the back of her neck. She turned again, and this time she wasn't alone. A figure stood at the edge of the square, its body obscured by the fog. It was tall and twisted, its limbs too long and unnatural. The head was tilted at an odd angle, as if broken, and its eyes, hollow, black pits, stared directly at her. Rachel stumbled backward, tripping over the gnarled roots of the oak tree. Her breath came in panicked gasps as the figure began to move toward her, slow and deliberate. Its limbs creaked like ancient wood, its bones cracking with every step. A voice, soft and lilting, filled her mind. Annabelle. Rachel shook her head, trying to clear the words from her mind, but the voice grew louder. Annabelle wants to come home. Terror seized her as she realized the voice wasn't coming from outside. It was inside her head. The figure was almost upon her now, its hand reaching out, long fingers curling like talons. She scrambled to her feet and ran, her heart hammering in her chest. But the town wouldn't let her leave. Every corner she turned led her back to the square, back to the tree and the figure waiting beneath it. The fog thickened, swirling around her, trapping her. And then, just as she thought she had lost it, the figure appeared in front of her again, closer this time. Its hand reached out, brushing her skin with an icy touch. The voice screamed in her mind, "You are cursed. You are ours now." Rachel fell to the ground, her body convulsing as darkness overtook her. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the figure leaning over her, its hollow eyes filling her vision. And then silence. The next morning, Hollow Ridge remained as it always had, quiet, abandoned, and untouched by time. But if you stood in the town square and listened closely, you might hear the faintest of whispers on the wind. Whispers of those who had been claimed by the curse, their voices forever lost in the fog. And if you looked closely, you would see a new name carved into the oak tree, Rachel Woods. Another soul, another victim, swallowed by the fear of Hollow Ridge. The Ghost of Hollow Ridge. In the quiet, fog-laden town of Hollow Ridge, nestled deep in the valley between darkened hills, there was a tale as old as the town itself. The townsfolk whispered of a specter that haunted their streets, a ghost that roamed the winding roads and misty woods once the sun dipped beneath the horizon. It was a tale every child in Hollow Ridge grew up with, but one none dared to test. This ghost, known only as the Rider of Hollow Ridge, was said to be a harbinger of death, a shadow of vengeance. The story began over a century ago, during a harsh winter that seemed unending. Hollow Ridge was a farming village back then, relying on its crops and livestock to survive. One man stood out among the town's few inhabitants, Gideon Hale, a wealthy landowner, respected but feared by those around him. His cruelty was infamous. He would seize land, force families into poverty, and show no mercy when collecting debts. The town despised him, but no one had the courage to stand against him. One cold autumn night, Gideon was found dead near the edge of the woods, his body trampled by hooves, as if an enraged horse had crushed him underfoot. No one knew what had truly happened that night, but the town's whispers grew. Some said Gideon had wronged the wrong person. Others claimed it was the work of wild animals. But a few spoke of something darker, a force of nature that had come to exact revenge for his greed. Soon after his death, strange sightings began. Late at night, villagers spoke of hearing the clopping of hooves in the distance, but no horses were to be seen. Then, people started disappearing, one by one, often on nights when the mist was thickest. The only clue left behind was a single hoofprint near their homes, pressed deep into the earth as if made by an unseen force. They say that Gideon Hale had become the Rider of Hollow Ridge, condemned to roam the town in search of those who owed him in life, and even after death. His figure, often glimpsed through the fog, was a ghastly sight, clad in dark, tattered clothing, astride a massive black horse, its eyes glowing with an unnatural red light. And while the rider had no head to speak of, an eerie lantern hung from the saddle, casting an otherworldly glow over the mist. Some said his head was in that lantern. Others believed it was buried deep in the woods, waiting to be reunited with his ghost. Every year, on the anniversary of his death, the rider grew bolder, venturing closer to the heart of the town. He would appear in the fog, his horse's hooves sending tremors through the earth, and any who dared look into the glow of the lantern would never be seen again. The townsfolk had learned to fear the mist. They would bolt their doors, cover their windows, and offer prayers when the fog rolled in from the hills. But even that didn't always keep the rider away. One autumn, a young schoolteacher named Eliza came to Hollow Ridge, unaware of the dark history that shrouded the town. The villagers tried to warn her, but she scoffed at the superstition, convinced that the tale was merely a story to scare children. She dismissed the warnings and continued to walk the winding road back to her cottage each evening, long after the sun had set. One night, as she returned from the village tavern, a thick fog descended upon the road, curling through the trees and creeping across the path. Eliza, though uneasy, continued her walk, her boots crunching softly on the gravel. As the mist grew denser, the sound of hooves echoed in the distance, growing louder with each step. Eliza's heart quickened, her pulse pounding in her ears. Then she saw him. The rider of Hollow Ridge emerged from the fog, towering and menacing atop his monstrous steed. The lantern at his side flickered, casting grotesque shadows that danced across the misty road. The horse's eyes gleamed with malice, and though the rider had no head, Eliza felt the weight of his gaze upon her. Frozen in place, Eliza could barely breathe as the ghostly figure advanced. The cold grip of fear tightened around her throat as she remembered the stories, the warnings she had so easily brushed aside. In the distance, the faint sound of a church bell rang, but it was too late. The last thing Eliza saw was the cold light of the lantern, swaying gently in the fog before everything went black. The next morning, the townspeople found her cottage empty. A single hoof print, deep and foreboding, was stamped into the soft earth just outside her door. Eliza was never seen again. And so, the legend of the Rider of Hollow Ridge lives on, a chilling reminder to all who pass through. Beware the fog, for when the mist rolls in and the hooves begin to echo, the rider is near, and he is always seeking someone to take with him into the night. The people of Hollow Ridge know, when the rider comes, there is no escape.